Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice, 100 small choices. Winter mountains do not bargain. They do not negotiate. They do not forgive. They wait. They wait for confidence to become commitment, for commitment to become stubbornness, and for stubbornness to become the final mistake a body cannot survive. In cold, thin air, the distance between almost there and never coming home can be measured in a handful of steps, a few degrees of temperature, or one decision to keep climbing instead of turning back. Nature does not care how experienced you are. It does not care how close you are to the summit or how badly you want the view. It only keeps score of preparation, timing, and judgment. And once a mountain begins collecting its debt, every minute costs more than the last. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. Act 1. A summit worth chasing. Kirsten Gertner was 33 years old. She was drawn to the mountains the way many people are, not for conquest, but for clarity. Thomas Planberger was her partner on the climb, an experienced Austrian mountaineer who had spent years learning the language that high peaks speak in wind and ice and silence. On paper, they made a reasonable team. In practice, they did not. The climb they chose was a recreational winter ascent of Grossglockner, Austria's highest mountain. It was meant to be a shared achievement, a photograph at the top, a story they would tell for years. Prosecutors would later argue that the gap between what Thomas could handle and what Kirsten could handle was not a small one. It was significant. And in the mountains, a significant gap in experience is not a footnote. It is a fault line. Grossglockner rises 3,798 meters above sea level. It's 12,461 feet of rock and ice that does not soften itself for anyone's ambition. Their intended route was the Stuttelgrat, the Stuttel Ridge, a classic alpine line that climbers speak of with respect in the summer months. In winter, respect is not enough. The ridge becomes something else entirely, coated in ice, scoured by wind, shortened by darkness, and lined with exposure that punishes even a single wrong step. Many climbers will tell you that a winter ascent and a summer ascent of the same route are not the same mountain at all. The rock does not change, everything else does. The margin for error, wide in July, narrows in January until it disappears completely. This was the legal question that would come to define what happened to Kirsten Gertner. When does the more experienced partner become responsible for the safety of the less experienced one? When one climber leads and the other follows. At what point does guidance become a duty? The court would eventually conclude that the answer mattered enormously, that experience is not just a skill someone carries up a mountain, it is a form of authority, and authority carries weight. For Kirsten Gertner and Thomas Planberger, what began as a winter ascent of Austria's highest mountain would become a tragedy that ended not at the summit but in a courtroom. Before the first mistake was made, the mountain had already established every rule they would have to follow. 8-2. The mountain makes the rules. Grossglockner does not change its terms for anyone. In winter, the mountain layers new hazards onto old ones. Snow buries the mixed terrain that climbers use for handholds and footing. The ridgeline, already exposed in summer, becomes a corridor with almost no shelter from wind or falling temperature. Escape routes, the paths a climber might use to retreat quickly if conditions turn, narrow or vanish beneath fresh snowfall, and the weather itself becomes unstable, capable of shifting from tolerable to lethal within an hour. Technical difficulty on a route like the Stuttelgrat does not rise gradually after snowfall. It rises sharply. A ridge that offered secure holds in August can offer nothing but ice-glazed rock in January. Holds that look solid and are not footing that appears reliable and gives way without warning. The conditions recorded around the time of the climb painted a portrait of a mountain in no mood for mistakes. Temperatures hovered near -8 or -9 degrees Celsius. Winds moved across the ridge at roughly 72 kilometers per hour and about 45 miles per hour, strong enough to steal balance from a tired climber, and strip heat from exposed skin in seconds. Combined, these conditions produce an effective wind chill approaching -20 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the body does not lose heat, it hemorrhages it. Wind is a thief that does not announce itself. It pulls warmth away from the body far faster than stillness ever could, and it does so continuously, relentlessly, for as long as a climber remains exposed. Every additional minute on an unprotected ridge in that kind of wind is a minute the body cannot get back. Officially, the hazards of a winter alpine ascent are well documented and rarely disputed among those who study them. Hypothermia, exhaustion, prolonged exposure, the creeping arrival of darkness, which does more than remove visibility. It removes options. After nightfall, helicopter rescue becomes far more difficult, sometimes impossible, leaving climbers who fall behind schedule with a narrowing window in which help can reach them at all. This is why experienced alpinists build turnaround times into their planning long before they ever leave the trailhead. A turnaround time is not a suggestion. It is a promise made to oneself in a moment of clear thinking, meant to be honored later in a moment when thinking is no longer clear. Descending safely, according to those who have spent decades in these mountains, matters more than standing on any summit. The summit will still be there next season. A climber who is not careful may not be. And yet, the mountain sets one more trap, a psychological one. And it is perhaps the cruelest of all. It is the whisper that arrives when the body is exhausted and the light is fading and the top feels close enough to touch. Only 50 meters left. Those 5 words have ended more climbs and more lives than almost any single piece of bad weather. The final meters of an ascent are statistically among the most dangerous. Not because the terrain worsens, but because judgment does. Fatigue clouds risk assessment precisely when risk assessment matters most. The climber who has already given hours of effort is the climber least equipped to decide, objectively, whether to give 1 hour more. The mountain had issued every warning it ever gives. The next decisions belonged entirely to the climbers. Act 3. One decision becomes 10. No tragedy in the mountains begins with a single catastrophic error. It begins with a small one, followed by another, each reasonable in isolation, each compounding the one before it. The first decision was the choice of objective itself. Prosecutors would later argue that the climb exceeded what the less experienced member of the team could safely handle. The judge, reviewing the case afterward, made an observation that would echo through the verdict. The experience levels of the 2 climbers were vastly different. In mountaineering, leadership is not a title. It is a responsibility that follows the person who understands the terrain, the weather, and the risk better than their partner does. When that person chooses an objective, they are not choosing for themselves alone. The second set of decisions concerned equipment. According to the record, an emergency blanket was carried, a bivouac sack, a compact emergency shelter designed to slow the loss of body heat in exactly the kind of situation the climbers would soon face, was carried as well. Prosecutors raised questions about other equipment choices too, including footwear and the broader winter climbing setup. But the detail that mattered most was simpler than any list of gear. The blanket stayed in the pack. The bivouac sack stayed in the pack. Emergency equipment carried but never deployed protects no one. A tool left inside a backpack is, for all practical purposes, a tool that was never brought at all. The third failure was a matter of time, and time on a mountain does not forgive delay. Progress slowed. It fell behind the schedule the climbers had planned. Daylight, which had seemed abundant at the start of the day, began to run out, and instead of treating that slippage as the warning it was, the pair continued upward. Fatigue accumulated with every step. Each hour lost did not simply vanish. It started a tour, and it compounded, adding weight to every decision that came after it. The fourth failure was the refusal to turn around. They were close to the summit. They had already invested enormous physical effort to get there. The temptation to finish, to convert all of that suffering into a completed climb rather than an abandoned one, it's a psychological force that mountaineers have a name for. Summit fever. It is not an official medical diagnosis. It is something closer to a trap of the mind. A fever in the sense that it clouds judgment the way a real fever clouds thought, pushing a climber toward the one outcome that feels like success and away from the one that would have kept them alive. Experienced climbers often say that turning around, walking away from a summit within reach is not a failure. It is the single hardest skill in mountaineering, and the one that separates those who come home from those who do not. The fifth set of failures involved communication, and this is where the chain of small mistakes became something closer to a locked door. According to trial reporting, the emergency notification that should have alerted authorities to the climber's deteriorating situation was delayed. Contact with rescue services, when it did happen, was incomplete. Police attempted repeated contact with the pair as concern grew. But follow-up communication was missed after Thomas placed his phone into airplane mode, an attempt to preserve battery life that instead severed the one thread connecting 2 exhausted climbers to the people who might have saved them. Rescue planning depends on continuous communication the way a patient depends on a heartbeat. Interrupt it, even briefly, even for a reasonable seeming purpose, and the entire system built to save a life can fail to locate the person it is trying to reach. By the time the final decision was made, the mountain no longer needed another mistake. AC 4. The body surrenders. What happens to a human body on an exposed ridge, hours behind schedule, in wind chill approaching minus 20 degrees Celsius, is not mysterious. It is physiology, and physiology does not make exceptions for good intentions. Exhaustion arrives first, though it rarely announces itself as exhaustion. It presents as slowness. Movements that once came automatically now require conscious effort. Energy reserves that fueled the ascent for hours begin to run dry, and as they do, the body's ability to generate its own heat declines along with them. A tired body is a cold body because the furnace that keeps it warm is powered by the same fuel that powers its muscles. Then hypothermia begins, and it begins quietly. Uncontrollable shivering is the body's first and most primitive defense, a desperate attempt to generate heat through motion, but shivering itself burns precious energy the body can no longer easily replace. As core temperature continues to fall, dexterity goes next. Fingers that once tied knots and gripped rock begin to fail at simple tasks. Judgment follows closely behind. Thinking slows. Decisions that would have been obvious hours earlier become difficult, then impossible to reach. This is perhaps the cruelest mechanism of hypothermia. It disables the very faculty a person would need to recognize that something is wrong. Victims of advanced hypothermia often do not feel as cold as an outside observer would expect. Some feel paradoxically warm. The mind, deprived of the oxygen and glucose it needs to function normally, loses its ability to accurately assess its own condition. A climber in this state is not simply cold. They are cut off from the part of themselves that would normally sound the alarm. From there, the progression is well documented and rarely merciful. Confusion deepens. The ability to continue climbing, to place one foot ahead of the other with any coordination, disappears. Core cooling accelerates as the body's remaining defenses are overwhelmed. Eventually, consciousness itself is lost. The final hours of Kirsten Gertner's life followed this progression, according to the documented timeline presented at trial. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, with his partner in a state of severe deterioration and no rescue in sight, Thomas made the decision to leave her and seek help. He returned roughly 6.5 hours later. By then, Kirsten had died of hypothermia, alone on the mountain that had spent the entire night collecting the debt her exhaustion had incurred. Prosecutors would later argue that earlier intervention could likely have saved her life. Not certainly, as mountains rarely permit certainty, but likely. And likely is the word that would haunt the rest of this case, because likely means preventable. The climb had ended hours earlier. The investigation was only beginning. Act 5. From rescue to criminal court. The rescue response began the way most alpine rescues do, with absence. Authorities grew concerned when the pair failed to descend on schedule. A helicopter was eventually involved in the search, though the exact timeline of its deployment would later come under scrutiny. Police attempted to reach the climbers by phone as the hours stretched on, and the same communication difficulties that had plagued the climb itself now complicated the rescue meant to end it. What followed was not simply a mountain rescue operation. It became a criminal investigation, and investigators identified a chain of failures that prosecutors would eventually organize into roughly 9 distinct points of breakdown. Planning failures, equipment failures, the decision to continue the ascent despite falling behind schedule, delays in requesting emergency assistance, failures in managing exposure to cold and wind once the situation began to deteriorate. Each one, examined alone, might be dismissed as an unfortunate but understandable lapse. Examined together, they formed a pattern that a court could not ignore. In February of 2026, the Innsbruck Regional Court delivered its verdict. Thomas Planberger was convicted of grossly negligent manslaughter. He received a 5-month suspended prison sentence and a fine of €9,600. It is worth pausing on the legal foundation of that conviction, because it is not what many assume. This was not a finding that Thomas Planberger intended harm. No court suggested malice. The conviction rested entirely on negligence, on the argument that a reasonable, more experienced climber in his position, with his knowledge of the mountain and his partner's limitations, should have made different choices, and that the failure to do so carried consequences the law was willing to recognize as criminal. The case drew international attention for reasons that extend well beyond the Alps. Criminal convictions arising from recreational mountaineering decisions remain rare. Most alpine deaths are treated, understandably, as tragic accidents. The mountain's fault, if a mountain can be said to have fault at all. This case reopened a debate that climbing communities have quietly carried for years. What legal responsibility does a more experienced partner owe to a less experienced one? Where does mentorship end and liability begin? For those who study wilderness safety, the case became something else too. A reminder that accidents in remote places do not stay confined to the mountain where they occurred. When preventable failures accumulate closely enough, when the chain of small decisions becomes long enough and clear enough, the wilderness can hand its verdict to a courtroom instead of leaving it buried in snow. The court assigned legal responsibility. The mountain had already delivered its own verdict. 8-6. What the mountain leaves behind. A mountain almost never kills with a single mistake. It collects them patiently, one at a time, until the total becomes unpayable. This chain could have been broken before the climb ever began by choosing an objective that matched the ability of the least experienced person on the rope, not the ambition of the most experienced one. It could have ended when the schedule slipped and the gap between plan and reality first became visible. It could have ended when daylight began to fade and the temperature dropped and the wind rose to 72 kilometers an hour across an unprotected ridge. It could have ended at any point while turning around was still technically an option, which for most of that day it was. It could have changed the moment the emergency blanket came out of the pack instead of staying folded inside it. It could have changed with a phone left on, a call for help placed an hour earlier, a decision to treat survival, not the summit, as the only outcome that mattered. None of these were dramatic choices. None of them required extraordinary heroism or extraordinary technical skill. They required only the willingness to stop, to admit that conditions had changed, and to accept that the mountain was not going to make an exception for two people who had already come so far. Kirsten Gertner was more than a name in a court file. She was 33 years old and she went into the mountains the way countless people do, trusting the plan, trusting her partner, trusting that experience on the rope ahead of her meant safety behind it. Thomas Planberger became more than a climber who made a series of bad decisions under pressure. He became, in the eyes of an Austrian court, a case study in what the law now expects of those who lead others into terrain that does not forgive. Their story is a reminder that wilderness tragedies are rarely sudden, however sudden they may look from the outside. They are built one reasonable seeming choice at a time, a slower pace accepted without alarm, a turnaround time quietly abandoned, a phone switch to airplane mode for a reason that made sense in the moment. Until there are no good choices left, only a body on a ridge and a phone call made too late. If you find yourself standing where they stood, weighing a summit against a schedule, remember what the mountain never forgets. It does not care how far you have already climbed. It only cares what you do next. Turn around while turning around is still a choice. Bring the equipment that saves lives and use it before you need it desperately. Keep the line of communication open, even when the battery runs low. Treat the summit as optional in survival, as the only mandatory outcome of any climb you ever attempt. Kirsten Gertner died on a mountain that gave every warning it was ever going to give. Thomas Planberger lived to stand in a courtroom and hear a judge describe in careful legal language exactly where the chain of decisions went wrong. Neither outcome was inevitable. Both were, in the end, 100 small choices, and every step of it was preventable. If you made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.